Writer Media Group original.
Welcome to the Versed podcast. My name is John. Thanks for joining me in this daily pursuit to become more perceptive to what the Bible says. Today, reading from the Gospel of John, chapter 15, verses 1 through 5. Let's get into it. I'm sure you've heard about the concept of plants and trees needing to be pruned in order to grow, right? And we apply that to our own lives in terms of boundary setting, to prune back this relationship, or to prune this kind of work that I'm doing so I can spend more time with my family, or to prune back my finances for X, Y, Z. And while the process of creating and setting and sticking to boundaries is a good one, I think it's incorrectly applied to this biblical concept of pruning. Why? Well, we're about to find out in today's verses. So before we dive in, a bit of historical and biblical context here. We're reading part of John's account of Jesus' final teaching about being the true vine. And this was the time of the Last Supper and Jesus washing the disciples' feet. The same evening, Jesus would be betrayed and arrested. And Jesus was teaching to the disciples, and he frequently used agriculture imagery in his teaching in order to connect culturally to the people to help them understand. But in this teaching and in this lesson, he's referring back to the prophet Isaiah, who spoke to Israel as being God's vineyard. God expected them to bear fruit back then, but they ultimately produced nothing. And in contrast, Jesus came as the authentic vine, perfectly obeying the will of God. So Jesus is our connection to God the Father. So we're about to listen to a brief section of that teaching in John chapter 15, verses 1 to 5. I am the true grapevine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch of mine that does not produce fruit, and he prunes the branches that do bear fruit so they will produce even more. You have already been pruned and purified by the message I have given you. Remain in me, and I will remain in you. For a branch cannot produce fruit if it is severed from the vine, and you cannot be fruitful unless you remain in me. God's goal for every Christian is to increase in fruit bearing. Our progression goes from no fruit to some fruit to more fruit to much fruit to remaining fruit. So to be fruitful is to live a life of spiritual usefulness and to be productive, not for our own benefit, but for the benefit of others and for ultimately the glory of God. It's interesting to analyze the analogy of fruit and its characteristics and how that applies to our own lives. Tony Evans breaks it down in this way as I was reading his commentary on these verses. Fruit has three main characteristics. The first is that fruit reflects the character of the tree. Apples come from apple trees. Oranges come from orange trees. The fruit in our lives should reflect Jesus. If you do call yourself a follower of Jesus, if you are a Christian, it should reflect him, his attitude, his character, what he does. Number two, fruit is visible. When you see fruit on a tree, you can easily identify the tree. Christians should be visible followers of Jesus so that others can easily identify the source. And the third and final main characteristic of fruit is that fruit is for the benefit of others. If you're constantly serving yourself, if the fruit is only for the tree itself, the fruit will stay on the vine, it will rot, and it will die on the vine. Fruit is for the benefit of others. It should be given away. So let's actually circle back to the misconception of pruning and what was revealed in today's verses. It's easy to misunderstand pruning as the setting of boundaries. And the biblical principle of pruning is not actually something that we do ourselves. Only God does the pruning. And pruning is only necessary for healthy plants. In verse 2, it says, God cuts off every branch that does not produce fruit, but that he prunes the branches that do bear fruit, that are connected to him, so that they can actually produce more fruit. The enemy wants you to believe that you are a plant that does not need to be pruned, and that God is cutting you off from what is rightfully yours. Happiness, good food, good sex, good art, good rest. The reality is that the enemy wants to cut you off from your source, the capital S source, and turn you to your coping mechanisms and plug you into that source, which will just bring this metallic temporary love and confuse us to think it's something that it's not. What God offers is something so much bigger and better than that. God is pruning away what you do not need in order to create more growth. It is the ultimate act of love that God does that for us, that it's not left to us. We don't have to prune it ourselves, but that when we are connected to the vine, when we rest and abide and remain and stay connected to him, we will bloom. He will do the pruning. We will produce more fruit when we stay connected to the vine. When we get confused, when we try to do it ourselves, when our source is something other than him, we will fail, we will rot, and we will die. Don't let the enemy confuse you today. Stay connected, remain and abide in God, and you will bloom. Take a minute or so to reflect, to pray, to meditate on that. Do that for a minute and then come back on the other side. So good to think about our source, and are we producing fruit, and what that reveals. Thanks for listening to the podcast today. I'm so glad you are in this journey and on this pursuit with me to become more perceptive to what the Bible says. Thank you for being here. If it's your first time, welcome, welcome. I hope you stay and stick around, and I hope that this podcast has brought you value. If you wouldn't mind, in the meantime, leaving a rating and a review on the podcast, that helps other people discover it. It also helps me make the podcast better. There's resources for you as well to take your studies even deeper, linked in the show notes, as well as a link to my social media if you have any questions. So check out all of that stuff. It's in the show notes. My friends, make hope the loudest thing possible today. We'll talk tomorrow.